As I imagine many of you were, I spent my Wednesday glued in horror to my television. I can't even begin to express the feelings that I had that day. I imagine you already know what that was like. But the incredible amount of sadness and despair and grief and disbelief as I watched those events unfold, and I watched all of that anger and hatred and violence come across my television screen into my soul, and I could only ask myself a couple of questions. What are we doing? I mean, really, what are we doing? And who are we? And those questions have stayed with me. And as I was preparing this sermon, they hung in the back of my mind and in my heart. And we come here today, and we actually, most of us don't even want to talk about it anymore. We want it to really just go away. And we want instead a message of hope and comfort, and we want some good news for a moment. And so we're given this beautiful story of Jesus' baptism. And yet we know that even this story in this church, inside the Christian church, that this story has been its own form of division. That we have let our theology and our ideology around baptism just divide us further. Are we baptizing for the forgiveness of sin, or are we baptizing to welcome new members into the community? Should we baptize infants, or maybe we should only baptize adults? And do we baptize by sprinkling or pouring or immersion? And even in these sacred walls around the world, we have allowed these silly, insignificant things to divide us and to decide who's in and who's out, who's with us and who's against us. And that has happened because we have once again missed the point. At least for me, this story today has very little to do with all of that. That what Mark is offering us in this story today is this amazing story of God's initiative. That again, this God with us, so desiring to be part of the life of Jesus, that God was willing to render, to tear open the heavens and to come down, to close the gap between God and humanity, between the heavens and the earth, to come into us so that we might hear, "You are loved." Now, Jesus, this man, was so open and so receptive and so ready for that experience that when Jesus came up out of the water, he could see it and hear it as clear as day. The presence of God in him. And the voice of God echoing in his heart, "You are loved." But this isn't just a story about God and Jesus. This is actually a story about all of us. This is a story about that same God who still to this day continues to try to breach that gap. It is about God's desire to be in us so deeply that God will continually move heaven and earth to help us see and to help us hear those words. This is a God who still whispers, sometimes screams to us, "You are loved." And when Jesus had this experience, he didn't just have an experience, he became possessed by God. And we know that he was possessed by God because of the way he lived his life. A life of love and light and healing and forgiveness and compassion and inclusion. The marks of a life possessed by the divine. This is the same possession that we are called to, that we are invited to. That this God who's still tearing open the heavens to get to us, who's still constantly whispering in our ear, wants nothing more than us to immerse ourselves in God. So that when we come out of that experience, that we are possessed and we will know that we are possessed because God's nature becomes our nature, because God's mind becomes our mind, and God's heart becomes our heart. And once that happens, once we fully take on God in that way, we understand that there is no real division here, that voice is not just for us. It's not just for those of us in the church. That voice is for everyone, that everyone is loved. That those rioters who stormed the Capitol with all of that rage and all of that anger, they're loved. That the people who were hurt and injured, they're loved. The people who did the injuring, they're loved. The politicians and the leaders who might have incited this and who turned the other way and refused to respond, they're loved. Those of us who sat in the horrors of our home, grief-stricken and appalled and horrified, all loved. This water, its baptism is a symbol to us, an invitation to go all in our relationship with God, to immerse ourselves in God's love, in God's light. Because when we are possessed by God like that, when we are possessed by God in the same way that Jesus was, when our heart and our mind and our nature is possessed by God, events like we saw on Wednesday, they aren't even possible. So the Messiah comes into the world and does not change it. Crystal clear to us today that that is true. But the Messiah comes into our hearts and changes our lives. God with us, in us, as us. That can change everything.